On October 2nd, 2017, a man finished the last show of a tour he'd performed on a broken hip. 7 days later, he was dead. 80 million records sold, 4 decades on stage, and a body full of fentanyl patches, prescribed for pain, he refused to stop working through. Tom Petty didn't just die. He played himself to death. And the question you need to ask yourself is this: why would a man worth tens of millions of dollars, with a granddaughter waiting at home, choose to finish a 53-date tour that was literally breaking his bones? By the end of this video, you'll understand why. Because the answer goes all the way back to a kid in Gainesville, Florida, who learned at 10 years old that the only safe place in the world was inside a song. Tom Petty's father, Earl, was an insurance salesman. He was also an alcoholic, and he beat his son. Not once, not as a lesson, regularly, with a belt, until the boy was covered in welts. Petty would later describe his father as a wild, gambling, drinker guy who couldn't understand why his son preferred daydreaming to sports. His mother, Kitty, worked at the local tax office and did what she could to shield Tom and his younger brother Bruce, who was 7 years younger. But Earl Petty was the kind of man who responded to a quiet, sensitive kid with fists and leather. That matters. Keep it in your mind, because every fight Tom Petty picked for the next 5 decades traces back to that house. When Tom was 10, his uncle took him to meet Elvis Presley. The king was shooting a movie called Follow That Dream in nearby Ocala. Elvis didn't say much to the kid standing at the edge of the set, but Petty later said that to a boy at an impressionable age. Presley was an incredible sight. The very next day, young Tom traded his slingshot for a friend's collection of Elvis and Little Richard records. That was it. The escape hatch opened, and Tom Petty walked through it with no intention of ever coming back. A couple of years later, he saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. If Elvis opened the door, the Beatles kicked it off its hinges. Petty said he knew in that moment he wanted to be in a band. Not maybe, not someday, right now. He taught himself guitar on a cheap instrument ordered from the Sears catalog. He even took some lessons from a fellow Gainesville kid named Don Felder, who would later join the Eagles. By 14, Tom was playing in local bar bands, underage, sneaking into clubs, because it was the only place that felt like home. One of those bands, the Epics, eventually morphed into a group called Mudcrutch. The guitarist, a kid named Mike Campbell. The keyboard player, Benmont Tench. Remember those 2 names. They're going to walk alongside Petty for the next 40 years. Through fire, through addiction, through everything. But here's what you need to understand about young Tom Petty. He didn't have a backup plan. He refused to create one. He said it himself. I didn't want anything to fall back on because I was not going to fall back. That sounds like youthful confidence. It wasn't. It was the desperation of a boy who knew that if music didn't work, the only option was going back to a house where his father's belt was waiting. At 17, Petty dropped out of high school. Mudcrutch packed their gear and drove to Los Angeles in the early 70s, chasing a record deal the way 1,000 other Southern boys had before them. Unlike most of those boys, they actually landed one. A small label called Shelter Records signed Mudcrutch. Petty also signed away his songwriting and publishing rights. The price? $10,000. Every song Tom Petty would ever write sold before he wrote it for less than the cost of a used car. He had no idea what he'd given up. He would later say, "I had no idea I'd never make money if I did that." And then, in a recording studio in 1975, Mudcrutch fell apart. Think about that for a second. You leave everything behind. You drive across the country. You land the contract, and then it evaporates in a studio while you're trying to make the album that was supposed to change your life. Most people go home after that. Petty didn't. He couldn't. There was nothing in Gainesville worth going back to. So one afternoon in 1975, he reunited with Campbell and Tench, pulled in bassist Ron Blair and drummer Stan Lynch, and they cut some demos together. The 5 of them sounded right. Not just good, right. Like they'd been a band their whole lives. They called themselves Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. And for a while, nobody outside a handful of Los Angeles clubs had any idea they existed. Their self-titled debut album came out in 1976 on Shelter Records. It contained 2 songs that would eventually become American rock standards, American Girl and Breakdown. But here's the cruel irony. In America, the record barely registered. It was England that discovered them first. British audiences heard something raw and honest in Petty's nasal twang. something that reminded them of the Byrds and the Beatles more than anything American radio was playing in the disco-saturated late 70s. The second album, You're Gonna Get It, came in 1978 and earned a gold disc. The Heartbreakers were building momentum, slowly, steadily. And then the music industry did what the music industry does. It tried to own Tom Petty. In 1979, Shelter Records and its distributor, ABC Records, were both sold to MCA, one of the largest labels in the world. Petty's contract transferred with the sale, like a line item on a balance sheet. Nobody asked him, nobody consulted him. He just woke up one morning and belonged to a corporation he'd never spoken to, never agreed to work with, and never trusted. Most artists would have accepted it, fought in private, hired a lawyer, negotiated quietly. Tom Petty did none of those things. He said he would not be bought and sold like a piece of meat. And then he declared war. Petty self-financed the recording of his third album. He deliberately made it as expensive as possible, running up over $500,000 in studio costs. Then he refused to release the record. MCA and Shelter sued him for breach of contract. So on May 23, 1979, Petty filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was a brilliant, reckless, absolutely insane move. By declaring bankruptcy, he froze the lawsuits. MCA couldn't touch him while the proceedings were active. He listed debts of over $576,000 against assets of barely $57,000. Whether those numbers were perfectly accurate didn't matter. The legal maneuver worked exactly as he'd planned. MCA blinked. They feared other artists would follow Petty's example. They agreed to release him from the old deal and signed him to their new subsidiary, Backstreet Records, with better terms. Petty kept his publishing rights. The album he'd been holding hostage finally saw daylight. It was called Damn the Torpedoes, and it detonated. Released in October 1979, Damn the Torpedoes hit number 2 on the Billboard chart and camped there for 7 consecutive weeks. The only thing between Petty and the top spot was Pink Floyd's The Wall. It eventually went triple platinum. It gave the world Don't Do Me Like That, which cracked the top 10, and Refugee, which became an anthem for anyone who'd ever felt cornered. Rolling Stone gave it 5 stars and declared it the Petty album we've all been waiting for. But he still wasn't done fighting. When MCA tried to price the follow-up, Hard Promises, at $9.98, a full dollar above the standard retail price, Petty threatened to withhold the album again. He organized a fan protest. He called the media. MCA caved and released it at $8.98, $1. He went to war over a single dollar. Because it was never about the money, it was about the principle that fans shouldn't be gouged for an extra buck just because a label thought it could get away with it. Years later, other artists, TLC among them, would follow Petty's bankruptcy playbook when their own contracts became unbearable. This is the pattern you need to see. Tom Petty kept fighting against his father, against the industry, against anyone who tried to own, control, or exploit him. And winning those fights cost him something every single time. Here's the part people miss. Fighting a record label doesn't just drain your bank account, it drains you. While Petty was waging legal battles, other bands were making records, building audiences, living normal lives. Petty spent months in courtrooms and lawyers' offices instead of studios. He went $500,000 into debt. His managers were scrambling. His bandmates were wondering if they'd ever play again. The stress was relentless. And the thing about being the guy who never backs down is that the world keeps testing you. It never stops sending something new to fight. But the fights made him famous in a way the music alone hadn't. Petty became a folk hero, the rock star who stood up to the suits, the guy who chose bankruptcy over surrender. Fans didn't just like his songs, they believed in him. That belief would carry his career for decades. But it also created a trap. Once you become the man who never backs down, you can never back down. Not from anything. Not ever. Remember that. We'll come back to it. By the mid-'80s, the Heartbreakers were legitimate arena headliners. Albums like Long After Dark and Southern Accents sold well. Southern Accents was particularly ambitious. Petty wanted to make a sprawling concept album about the American South. He fought so hard for perfection in the studio that at one point he punched a wall and broke his left hand. Even his own creative process had become a battle. The band was tight, road-hardened, and restless. Petty collaborated with Stevie Nicks on Stop Draggin' My Heart Around, which became a top 10 hit and introduced him to a whole new audience. He was pushing creative boundaries, experimenting with synthesizers, working with producers he admired, Everything was accelerating. And then, on May 17, 1987, someone tried to murder Tom Petty and his entire family. An arsonist cut a hole in the back fence of Petty's Encino, California, home. Evidence suggested they'd been watching the house for days. In the early morning, as Petty, his wife Jane, their 5-year-old daughter, and a housekeeper were sitting down to breakfast, the arsonist poured lighter fluid on a rear wooden staircase and lit it. The house was wood. It went up like a matchbox. The housekeeper's hair caught fire as she tried to fight the blaze. Petty grabbed a garden hose. It melted in his hands. He got his daughter and wife out first, then crawled through thickening smoke himself. Within an hour, the entire house was destroyed. The fire caused over $1 million in damage. The only room that survived was the basement recording studio, where some original tapes were salvaged. The arsonist was never identified. The motive was never established. The case remains unsolved to this day. Petty was shattered. He compared it to being violated. He said it took years to shake the fear. He couldn't even bring himself to use the word fire in a song. But he did write one song about the experience. You've heard it. You probably know every word. It's called I Won't Back Down. 3 words that became the thesis statement of his entire existence. With no home to return to, Petty took his family on the road. The Heartbreakers were already booked to tour with Bob Dylan, so the Pettys lived out of hotels and tour buses while their house was rebuilt. Dylan himself later admitted something remarkable about that period. He said Tom was at the top of his game, and I was at the bottom of mine. Dylan was so depleted he'd considered walking away from music entirely. That friendship between Petty and Dylan, combined with a chance connection to George Harrison and producer Jeff Lynne, created one of the most improbable moments in rock history. Harrison needed a B-side track for a single from his Cloud 9 album. He called Lynne to help him write and produce it. They needed a studio, so they went to Dylan's home setup in Malibu. But Harrison had left a guitar at Petty's house nearby, so he swung by to pick it up. Petty looked at him and said, "Oh, good. I was wondering what I was going to do tomorrow." The next day, Roy Orbison showed up too. 5 of the most iconic musicians alive, crammed into Bob Dylan's garage, wrote and recorded a track called Handle with Care. It was far too good for a B-side, so they formed a band, the Traveling Wilburys. Dylan, Harrison, Lynne, Orbison, and Petty. Perhaps the most absurd supergroup ever assembled. Their debut album, Traveling Wilburys Volume 1, was supposed to be a lark. 5 friends goofing around in a garage. Instead, it became one of the best-selling albums of 1988. It earned them the Grammy for Best Rock Performance in 1989. And Tom Petty, the kid from Gainesville standing alongside a Beatle, a folk legend, the voice behind Oh Pretty Woman, and the man who invented arena rock, didn't look like a sidekick. He looked like an equal. Roy Orbison died of a heart attack just 2 months after the album's release, in December 1988. He was 52. The Wilburys recorded a second album without him. But the magic of that first record, 5 men in a room who genuinely liked each other, making music with no agenda and no pressure, would remain one of the purest moments in Petty's career. It proved something he'd always suspected, that music was supposed to be joyful, that the best songs come when nobody's fighting. The Wilburys opened a new creative channel. Jeff Lynne began producing Petty's first solo album, Full Moon Fever. They wrote fast. The chemistry was immediate. Most of the Heartbreakers actually played on the record, but the album was credited to Petty alone. Lynne gave the production a polished, shimmering quality that suited Petty's songwriting perfectly. And then MCA rejected it. Let that sink in. The label heard Free Fallin', I Won't Back Down, and Runnin' Down a Dream, 3 songs that would become permanent fixtures of American culture, and said no thanks. They were spectacularly wrong. Full Moon Fever, released in April 1989, reached number 3 on the Billboard 200, and eventually sold over 5 million copies. It spawned 5 top 100 singles. Free Fallin' became Petty's highest-charting and longest-running song, a track so woven into American culture that you can't drive through the San Fernando Valley without hearing it in your head. I Won't Back Down featured George Harrison on guitar and backing vocals. It became an anthem of resilience that transcended rock music entirely, the song that was played on national television after September 11, 2001, when the country needed to hear someone say they weren't going to give in. Can you imagine being the executive at MCA who passed on that? But success has a cost. And this time, the price was the band itself. The Heartbreakers resented Full Moon Fever. They'd played on most of the album. Campbell co-wrote tracks. Tench played keyboards. But the credit went to Petty alone. The record that made him a solo superstar made them feel invisible. Drummer Stan Lynch, already the most volatile and outspoken personality in the group, grew openly frustrated. He felt sidelined, replaceable. The internal fractures that would eventually shatter the band's original lineup started widening here, with every sold-out arena on the Full Moon Fever tour. Petty didn't slow down. He couldn't. In 1992, at 40 years old, he began working with legendary producer Rick Rubin on what he envisioned as a double album. His professional life was at its zenith. His personal life was disintegrating. His marriage to Jane Benyo was falling apart. They'd been together since 1974, married for over 2 decades. And the relationship had become something Petty described in terms that echo his childhood. "I was used to living in hell. My parents' marriage was hell. I lived through being terribly abused as a kid, and then I found myself in an abusive marriage. The pattern is almost unbearable to see. The boy who escaped his father's house by becoming a rock star had recreated the same kind of pain in his own home. Some prisons are invisible. Wildflowers became both Petty's refuge and his reckoning." The sessions stretched from the summer of 1992 to early 1994, recorded at Sound City and Ocean Way Studios in Los Angeles. Rubin stripped away the polished production that Jeff Lynne had brought to Full Moon Fever. He wanted the songs bare, intimate, close enough that you could hear Petty breathing between lines. And Petty delivered. He wrote 25 songs, enough for the double album he'd envisioned. Warner Brothers cut it down to 15 tracks. What remained was the most nakedly personal record Petty ever made. Songs about letting go, about giving yourself permission to leave, about the terrifying freedom of admitting that everything you've built might need to burn down so something new can grow. The title track alone, a gentle folk song about finding space to be yourself, became the kind of quiet anthem that fans tattooed on their arms and played at funerals and weddings alike. It went triple platinum. It sold more than 3 million copies. Petty called it his favorite record for the rest of his life. Benmont Tench said he always told people that's the best record we ever made. During those sessions, Petty fired Stan Lynch. 18 years together, gone. And when his marriage finally ended in divorce in 1996, the man who had survived arson, bankruptcy, and corporate warfare found himself sitting alone in a new house with nothing but silence and the accumulated weight of 50 years of pain. That's when the heroin started. Nobody knew. Not the band, not the public, not the woman he'd started dating, Dana York. Mike Campbell, the guitarist who'd been by his side since the Mudcrutch days, later said he knew an intervention would have been pointless. Petty was that stubborn. Campbell told an interviewer exactly how it would have gone. "Tom, I'm worried about you. You're hurting yourself. Maybe you ought to think about cleaning up." And Petty would have told him to mind his own business. His biographer, Warren Zanes, tried to understand how a 50-year-old man becomes a heroin addict. The answer was bleak. When Petty left his marriage and moved into a house by himself, everything slowed down just long enough for all the pain to catch up. The abuse from his father, the trauma of the fire, the collapse of his marriage, the guilt of what the divorce meant for his 2 daughters. Zanes called it the classic situation of midlife pinning a person down to the mat. Petty hid the addiction for years. He didn't reveal it publicly until Zanes published his biography in 2015, nearly 2 decades after the worst of it. He was ashamed. He was afraid kids who looked up to him would think heroin was an option. When he finally spoke, he was devastatingly honest. "Using heroin went against my grain. I didn't want to be enslaved to anything. And then, I fear that if I talk about it, people will think, well, I could do it and get off, but you can't." Very few people do. Dana York discovered his secret and stayed. Her own father had battled addiction, so she recognized what was happening. She didn't run. Petty went through treatment under medical supervision. He didn't go to a celebrity rehab clinic or disappear from public view. He fought the addiction the same way he fought everything else, privately, stubbornly, and on his own terms. He married Dana in 2001. He looked, for maybe the first time in his life, like a man who'd made it to the other side. And for a while, perhaps he had. The 2000s brought a kind of earned peace. In 2002, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in their first year of eligibility. The hall praised them as durable, resourceful, hard-working, likable, and unpretentious. Those words could have been Petty's epitaph. He also received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He won 3 Grammy Awards over the course of his career. More tours followed, more albums, each one solid, each one selling. The Highway Companion album in 2006. The Mojo album in 2010. In 2008, Petty performed the Super Bowl halftime show, standing in front of 100 million viewers. He even reunited Mudcrutch, his original Gainesville band, for 2 albums and some live shows, closing a circle that had been open for 30 years. The Heartbreakers weren't a nostalgia act. They were a working band, one of the last from their era that could still fill arenas on the strength of new material and tight musicianship, not just greatest hits set lists. Original bassist Ron Blair returned to the fold. Drummer Steve Ferrone replaced Stan Lynch. Guitarist Scott Thurston rounded out the lineup. The machine kept running. And here's a detail that tells you everything about Tom Petty's relationship with success. His first #1 album didn't arrive until 2014, with Hypnotic Eye. He'd been making records for nearly 40 years before he reached the top of the chart. 40 years. Most artists would have been crushed by that. Petty barely mentioned it. He didn't need the validation. He needed the work. But the body keeps a ledger. And by 2017, the bill was coming due. Tom Petty had emphysema. His knees were damaged. Most significantly, he had a fractured hip. When the Heartbreakers announced a 40th anniversary tour, Petty suspected it would be their last major outing. He told Rolling Stone, "We're all on the backside of our 60s. I have a granddaughter now I'd like to see as much as I can. I don't want to spend my life on the road. This tour will take me away for 4 months. With a little kid, that's a lot of time. 53 dates, 5 months. North America from end to end. The tour grossed over $61 million. And Tom Petty performed every single show on a hip fracture that worsened with each night on stage. Fentanyl patches managed the pain. Oxycodone helped. Sedatives eased the anxiety. An antidepressant kept the darkness at bay. The final show was September 25, 2017. The third of 3 sold-out nights at the Hollywood Bowl, which holds 17,500 people. Nearly 50,000 tickets were sold across those 3 dates alone, grossing over $5 million. The critics who reviewed the tour called the Heartbreakers one of America's most enduring rock bands. One writer said that seeing Petty on stage was like seeing the radio come to life. Petty opened the last show with Rockin' Around, With You, the first track from the Heartbreakers' 1976 debut album. He played Free Fallin', he played Refugee, he played Wildflowers. He played songs that spanned 4 decades, and each one sounded like it belonged in the room. During the concert, he told the crowd they were celebrating their 40th anniversary. He seemed relaxed, almost happy. Nobody in that audience had any idea that the man on stage could barely stand. He closed with American Girl, the same song that opened the first Heartbreakers album 41 years earlier. The same song that British fans had embraced when America wasn't listening. The same song that had survived every fight, every fire, every failure. The lights went down. The crowd screamed. And Tom Petty walked off stage for the last time. 1 week later, on the morning of October 2nd, Tom Petty was found unconscious at his Malibu home. Not breathing. Full cardiac arrest. He was rushed to UCLA Medical Center. He could not be revived. He was declared dead that evening, at the age of 66. The coroner's report arrived months later. Official cause: multi-system organ failure due to resuscitated cardiopulmonary arrest due to mixed drug toxicity. His system contained fentanyl, oxycodone, acetylfentanyl, dyspropionyl fentanyl, temazepam, alprazolam, and citalopram, all prescribed. None taken with the intent to end his life. His wife Dana and daughter Adria released a statement that cuts to the bone. On the day he died, he was informed his hip had graduated to a full-on break. It is our feeling that the pain was simply unbearable and was the cause for his overuse of medication. Despite this painful injury, he insisted on keeping his commitment to his fans, and he toured for 53 dates with a fractured hip. The family added something else. They said they hoped the report might spark a discussion about the opioid crisis. They wanted his death to mean something beyond grief. Because Tom Petty wasn't a reckless drug abuser. He was a 66-year-old man, with emphysema, destroyed knees, and a shattered hip, who was trying to manage pain that most people would have surrendered to months earlier. The medications that killed him were all legal, all prescribed, and together, they stopped his heart. Think about that. The man who wouldn't back down met something he couldn't outrun. Not a record label, not an arsonist, not heroin, his own body. And even then, he didn't stop. He played 53 shows. He stood on that stage and sang Free Fallin', with a hip that was shattering underneath him. And maybe that's the real answer to the question this whole story started with. Why would Tom Petty play himself to death? Because stopping was never an option. Not when he was 10, fleeing his father's belt into Elvis Presley records. Not when he was 25, declaring bankruptcy rather than surrender his publishing rights. Not when he was 37, crawling through smoke to pull his daughter from a burning house. Not when he was 50, shooting heroin into his veins because the pain of his divorce had nowhere else to go. And not when he was 66, standing under the lights at the Hollywood Bowl, singing American Girl, one last time for 17,000 people who loved him. Tom Petty sold over 80 million records. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He wrote songs that will outlast every person watching this. But the thing that made him extraordinary is the same thing that killed him. He wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop. The kid from Gainesville, who traded his slingshot for a stack of records, never found a moment where the music felt finished, where the fight felt won, where he could finally sit down, exhale, and say that's enough. The last song Tom Petty ever performed was American Girl, a song about someone standing on the edge, balancing between everything they've known and the terrifying freedom of letting go. He wrote it in 1976. He played it on September 25, 2017. 41 years apart, and the song still fit, because Tom Petty spent his entire life standing on that edge, fighting to stay there, refusing to step back. He just never came back from the last time he jumped.